This is a really important teaching for the history of the church because in it, Jesus gives us the essence of the law, the essence of what it means to follow the will of God. He kind of boils it all down to the most important points. And so we want to ask, what did he mean when he answered this question? How did he, what would he have been understood to have meant in his first century Jewish setting? And then what does he mean today for us as well? So in Matthew 22, verse 34 to 40, this is what happens. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they came together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. All right, so let's pause there. Unlike some of the previous Gospels we've had in previous weeks, this is a very short text. It's a very short Gospel. But there's a lot going on here and there's a lot to unpack. So let's walk through it together. First of all, the setting here. When it says that a lawyer came up to Jesus and asked him a question in the Revised Standard Version translation, what that really means is a doctor of the law. The word law, nomos in Greek, is a Greek translation of the Hebrew expression Torah, which simply refers to the law of God, the law of Israel, and was a kind of shorthand way for talking about the scriptures, the Jewish Torah, especially the first 5 books of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those were, for Jews, the Torah, the heart of the Jewish scriptures. You could even say that the 5 books of Moses were for the Jewish people what the 4 Gospels are for Christians. They're the foundation of the rest of the scriptures. They're the foundation of the Old Testament, just like the Gospels are the foundation of the New Testament. So what this lawyer is basically asking him is, what's the greatest commandment in the Pentateuch, in the 5 books of Moses? And if you've read the first 5 books of the Bible, you know they are long, they are detailed, and there's a lot of laws and a lot of commandments in them. In fact, by traditional Jewish counting, Moses gives the people of Israel in the first 5 books 613 laws. Okay, so 613 laws. And basically what this lawyer, this doctor of the law, this biblical scholar, that's basically what he was, a Jewish biblical scholar, is asking Jesus is, well, which one of the 613 is the most important? What's the greatest of all the laws? Now, if I were to ask you, what is the first commandment, which can mean both the first in numbering, but also the first in greatness, you might be inclined to say, well, the first of the 10 commandments. So Jesus could have legitimately answered the guy's question by going back to the Decalogue, the 10 words of God, what they're called the 10 commandments of Moses in Exodus chapter 20. He could have said to this Jewish scholar, well, the first commandment is, of course, the first commandment. I am the Lord your God, right? You shall have no other gods before me. The prohibition against idolatry. But Jesus doesn't do that. He doesn't go to the negative prohibition that Moses gives to Israel in the 10 Commandments. Instead, he goes to the positive law from Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verses 4 through 6. So if you go back to Deuteronomy 6, verse 4 through 6, this passage is called, in Jewish tradition, the Shema. The Hebrew word Shema means hear or listen. And they call this passage the Shema from the very first Hebrew word. Because in chapter 6, verse 4, it says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And it goes on to say, These words which I command you this day shall be upon your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign upon your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes, and you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. All right. Wow, that's pretty important. So the verses in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 to 6, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. That verse, the Shema, became for Jews a kind of creed, right? They would actually recite it following the words of Moses here when they rose in the morning, when they went about, so they do it at midday, and then also when they lie down, so they do it in the evening. And the custom developed of reciting the Shema multiple times a day. As far as we can tell, 3 times a day was the norm: morning, noon, and evening. Morning, noon, and evening. You would recite these words over and over again. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your might. So what Jesus is doing here, when he answers the Hebrew scholar's question, on the one hand, he's kind of doing something unexpected. He's not pointing to the first of the 10 Commandments. On the other hand, he's doing something really commonplace by pointing to the most well-known verses of the Bible for any Jew in the 1st century AD. So the Shema for Jews was the equivalent of the Our Father for Catholics, right? A lot of Catholics don't know, they aren't familiar with chapter and verses in the Bible. And sometimes our non-Catholic brothers and sisters can give us a hard time with that, right? Because they'll frequently memorize verses and memorize the chapters and verse where certain key passages are located. And Catholics can feel a little intimidated. But I always try to tell Catholic students of mine, if anyone says to you, well, do you know the Bible chapter and verse? You should always say, well, yes, I know Matthew 6, 9 to 13. Let me recite it for you. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, so on and so forth. Our Father. That passage from Scripture is well known to Christians because traditionally it actually would also be recited 3 times a day. That was a standard Catholic thing for a long time. You pray the Lord prayer, not just a long time, since the 1st century. In the Didache, it's an ancient Christian writing from the 1st century AD, said, pray the Our Father 3 times a day, morning, noon, evening, morning, noon, evening, as a kind of fulfillment of the Jewish praying of the Shema. So anyway, that's kind of a long side note, but it's important to see that Jesus is taking this prayer, which he himself would have recited 3 times a day as a faithful Jew. With Mary and Joseph, they would have prayed the Shema over and over again. He takes this creed of the Jewish people and he says, this is the greatest commandment. You are to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, which would mean your will, right? With all of your soul, which is the image of your life. The nephesh is the soul in the Old Testament. It's the Hebrew word for life. And with all of your mind, Jesus says as well. In other words, with your intellect. So it's a kind of composite but complete picture of the human person. In other words, you will love God with all that you have and with all that you are. Right? Now, before we go to the 2nd commandment, which Jesus is going to say, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, I think it's actually important to point out one more parallel from Jewish tradition. I found this really helpful for sharing with people about the meaning of the text. So there's a tradition in the collection of ancient Jewish beliefs and traditions known as the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud. This comes from around the 3rd to 5th century AD. There's the tradition of a very famous rabbi who lived a little after the time of Jesus called Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva was martyred by the Romans. He was actually skinned alive by the Romans. And the story of his martyrdom gives us a little bit of an insight into the importance of the Shema for the Jewish people, as well as into Jesus' interpretation here. So in the Babylonian Talmud, I have a copy right here, it gives this tradition. It says, when Rabbi Akiva was taken out for execution, it was the hour for the recital of the Shema. In other words, it was the time for prayer, time for reciting, I am the Lord your God, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your might. And it says, while they combed his flesh with iron combs, he was accepting upon himself the kingdom of heaven, which means he was reciting the prayer. His disciples said to him, our teacher, even to this point, in other words, are you still going to be reciting the Shema? And he said to them, all my days I've been troubled by this verse, with all your soul, which I interpret, even if he, God, takes your soul. I said, well, when shall I have the opportunity of fulfilling this verse? Now that I have the opportunity, shall I not fulfill it? So he prolonged the word echad in Hebrew, which means one, until he expired while saying it. That's from the Babylonian Talmud tractate Berachot, paragraph 61b. That's a powerful story. What does it show? Well, it says that Rabbi Akiva basically was saying, I never really understood what it meant to love God with all your soul until this moment, until I give my very life for the love of God. So as he's reciting this prayer, when he gets to the word, the Lord is your God, the Lord is one, he dies and gives his life for God. So in that context, I hope you can see why Jesus might have said that loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength was the most important. It's about a total gift of self to God, even unto death, which is what Jesus himself is going to do, obviously, on the cross. But then Jesus gives us a second commandment as well. He says there's a second commandment that's like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself.